The evening had started perfectly for Dr. Nathan Okafor. The brain surgery that morning, a tricky one that had kept him awake the night before, had gone better than expected. His patient, an elderly man with a tumor that other doctors had deemed inoperable, would now likely see his grandchildren grow up. It was the kind of day that reminded Nathan why he'd spent all those years studying, all those sleepless nights as a resident, all those missed family gatherings. "To Mr. Patel's recovery," said Dr. Aisha Chen, raising her glass of sparkling water. The four colleagues clinked glasses across the white tablecloth at Bella's Bistro, a popular spot downtown known for its fancy pasta and even fancier prices. "And to Nathan's steady hands," added Dr. Lee, the anesthesiologist who'd been with Nathan through hundreds of surgeries. "I swear, even when the power flickered for that second, you didn't even blink." Nathan smiled, feeling that warm glow of having done good work with good people. At 42, he had become one of the most respected neurosurgeons at Memorial Hospital, though he still felt like that nervous kid from his small hometown sometimes. His parents had cleaned office buildings at night so he could go to medical school. Nights like this made all their sacrifices worth it. Bella's Bistro hummed around them with the gentle clatter of silverware and the murmur of conversation. The lighting was warm, casting a golden glow on the exposed brick walls. Through the large windows, they could see the city lights beginning to twinkle as sunset faded into evening. Their waitress approached their table again. Nathan had noticed her sour expression when she'd first taken their order, but hadn't thought much of it. Everyone has bad days. But when she placed the drinks down, she practically slammed Nathan's water in front of him, splashing drops onto his shirt sleeve. "Oh, sorry about that," Nathan said automatically, though it clearly hadn't been his fault. He dabbed at his sleeve with a napkin. The waitress, her nemetic read Lindsay, didn't acknowledge him. Instead, she turned to Dr. Chen with a sudden smile. "Are you ready to order?" Throughout the meal, the pattern continued. Lindsay was warm and attentive to Nathan's colleagues, but barely looked at him when bringing his food. She'd ask if everyone else needed refills but skip him. Nathan caught Dr. Lee's questioning glance but gave a small shrug. He'd experienced this kind of treatment before. It wasn't worth making a scene over. When dessert arrived, Lindsay had brought everyone else's choices but forgotten Nathan's tiramisu. After he reminded her, she returned 10 minutes later, the dessert looking suspiciously smashed on one side. "I think we're ready for the check," Dr. Chen said, her voice noticeably cooler now. She'd noticed the treatment too. When the bill came, Nathan glanced over it and frowned. There were 2 extra appetizers they hadn't ordered. As chief of surgery, he was paying tonight, and while money wasn't the issue, the principal bothered him. "Excuse me," he called as Lindsay walked past. His voice was polite but firm. "There seems to be a mistake on our bill. We didn't order these calamari plates." Lindsay's face changed then, her forced customer service smile dropping completely. She snatched the bill from his hand and glared at it. "There's no mistake," she snapped. "Maybe you should learn to read English properly." The table fell silent. Even the nearby diners seemed to pause. Dr. Lee half rose from his seat. "I'm sorry," Nathan said calmly, "but we definitely didn't order." "Oh my God," Lindsay cut him off, her voice suddenly loud enough that heads turned throughout the restaurant. "If you're going to be this difficult, why don't you just go back to Africa?" The restaurant fell completely silent then. A glass shattered somewhere in the back. Nathan felt a cold wave wash over him, that familiar feeling he'd hoped, after all his accomplishments, all his years of service to the community, he wouldn't have to feel again. Across the room, the manager's head snapped up, his face frozen in shock. Dr. Chen's mouth hung open. Dr. Lee stood up fully now, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. And in that terrible quiet moment, Nathan had to decide how to respond. The silence that followed Lindsay's words seemed to stretch forever. Nathan felt every eye in the restaurant on him, waiting. His heart pounded in his chest, but outwardly, he remained still, his expression calm despite the storm inside. 20 years of performing surgery under pressure had taught him how to keep his hands steady even when everything was falling apart. "I'd like to speak with the manager, please," Nathan said, his voice quiet but clear in the hushed restaurant. He folded his napkin and placed it beside his half-eaten dessert. Dr. Lee was still standing, his face flushed with anger. "Are you kidding me?" Did everyone just hear what she said? He pulled out his phone and started recording. Dr. Chen followed suit, her fingers trembling slightly as she tapped her screen. This is completely unacceptable, she said, looking directly at Lindsay, who had taken a step back but maintained her defiant expression. A woman at the next table leaned toward her husband. I can't believe she just said that, she whispered, though in the silence her words carried. To a customer, to anyone. Nathan noticed a young couple by the window quietly asking for their check. An older man in the corner shook his head in disgust. 2 tables over, a group of friends were already posting on their phones, their faces glowing in the blue light of their screens. Nathan, we should leave, Dr. Wang said, reaching for her purse. We don't have to put up with this. No, Nathan replied, folding his hands on the table. I'd like to address this properly. He had walked away from incidents like this before, swallowing the hurt, telling himself it wasn't worth the trouble. Not tonight. The manager finally approached their table, moving with the reluctance of someone walking toward a car accident. He was a tall man with thinning hair and a carefully neutral expression that suggested he'd rather be anywhere else. Is there a problem here? He asked, looking between Nathan and Lindsay. Yes, Nathan replied before anyone else could speak. Your waitress just told me to go back to Africa because I questioned an error on our bill. The manager, Thomas, according to his name badge, pursed his lips. I'm sure there's been some misunderstanding. Lindsay is one of our best servers. There's no misunderstanding, Dr. Chen cut in, turning her phone so the screen faced Thomas. I have it on video. Thomas glanced at the phone and then quickly away, as if he could avoid the reality of the situation by not looking at it. Well, I apologize if you feel offended. Feel offended? Dr. Lee interrupted, his voice rising. Your waitress made a blatantly racist comment to our friend. This isn't about feelings. Nathan raised his hand slightly, and Dr. Lee stopped. Thomas, Nathan said, his voice still measured, I don't believe you understand the seriousness of what just happened. I'm not feeling offended. I was directly told to leave the country because of my race. More phones were out now. Nathan could see at least 5 people recording the conversation from surrounding tables. A couple near the door stood up and walked out, leaving cash on their table. Sir, please, Thomas said, lowering his voice. We can comp your meal tonight and… I don't want a free meal, Nathan replied. I want you to address the fact that your employee felt comfortable making a racist remark to a customer in your restaurant. Thomas turned to Lindsay, who was now standing with her arms crossed. Lindsay, did you say this? Lindsay rolled her eyes. He was being difficult about the bill. I just got frustrated. Being difficult justifies racism, Dr. Wang asked incredulously. Nathan stood up slowly. The movement caught everyone's attention. We'll be leaving now, he said, placing his credit card on the bill. But I want you both to know that what happened here tonight will not simply disappear. As they gathered their things, Nathan noticed Lindsay ducking behind the bar, whispering to another server who looked at Nathan and then quickly averted her eyes. In the corner of his vision, he saw Thomas hurriedly tapping on his phone. Damage control, no doubt. Outside, the night air felt cool against Nathan's face. A small crowd had gathered just beyond the restaurant's windows, some holding phones. Nathan, are you okay? Dr. Chen asked, placing a hand on his arm. He looked back at the restaurant, where Lindsay now watched from behind the bar, a strange smirk playing on her lips. Their eyes met through the glass. I'm fine, he said, though the familiar knot in his stomach suggested otherwise. But this isn't over. Nathan woke to the buzz of his phone dancing across his nightstand. It was 5:43 a.m. Too early for anything good. The screen showed 37 missed calls, 112 text messages, and countless notifications from apps he rarely used. His sister had called 8 times. Even his mother, who usually just left voice messages asking him to call back, had tried reaching him 4 times since midnight. He sat up, rubbing his eyes, and tapped on the most recent message from Dr. Chen. Nathan, the video is everywhere. News stations are asking for interviews. Call me. Still groggy, he'd opened his social media app. His stomach dropped. The top trending hashtag was hashtag #BellisRacism, followed by hashtag #GoBackToAfrica and hashtag #DocTorvsWaitress. A clip with over 2 million views showed Lindsay shouting those words at him, then cut to Thomas's half-hearted response. Another angle captured Nathan's calm reaction, Dr. Lee's outrage, and several customers walking out. The local news had already picked it up. The headline read, "Prestigious doctor told to go back to Africa at upscale city restaurant." His phone buzzed again, Dr. Wang this time. CNN just showed the clip. "Are you watching?" Nathan switched on the TV. There he was, in his blue dress shirt, looking straight at Lindsay as she spat those words. The anchor was saying, "Shocking display of racism captured on multiple phones last night." The target of the verbal attack, Dr. Nathan Okafor, is a respected neurosurgeon who has saved countless lives. He muted the TV and sat on the edge of his bed, trying to process it all. This wasn't the first time he'd faced racism, far from it, but it was the first time it had been so public, so unavoidable. His phone rang again. The hospital administrator. "Nathan, I just wanted to check if you're okay," she said when he answered. "And to let you know you can take the day off if needed. Your procedures have been covered." "I'm fine," he said automatically. "I'd rather work." The thought of sitting at home watching himself become a viral symbol of racism wasn't appealing. His patients needed him. "There are reporters in the parking lot," she warned. "Security can bring you in through the back entrance." Nathan sighed. "I'll be there in an hour." After a quick shower, he checked his phone again. The reaction had intensified. People were leaving thousands of one-star reviews on Bella's Bistro's page. "How dare you allow your staff to speak to customers like this? Boycott this racist establishment. Dr. Okafor deserves better. We all do." His sister had texted, "You okay? Mom's worried sick. Call her." He dialed his mother's number. "Nathan," she answered immediately. "Are you all right?" "I saw what happened." "I'm fine, Mom, really." "Your father and I didn't raise you to accept such treatment," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "But we did raise you to handle yourself with dignity. You did that." Her words hit him harder than the incident itself. His parents had left Nigeria before he was born, working tirelessly to give him opportunities. They'd faced worse than what happened at Bella's, but always with their heads held high. "I know, Mom. I'm okay." After reassuring her, he headed to the hospital, taking the back entrance as suggested. His first patient was an 8-year-old girl with a spinal condition. Her parents' nervous smiles reminded him why he became a doctor, to help people, regardless of who they were. By lunchtime, the story had grown. Local TV stations showed protesters gathered outside Bella's Bistro with signs reading "No place for racism" and "Respect for all." The restaurant had posted a statement calling the incident regrettable and promising to investigate. People were tearing it apart online for being too vague, too late. Dr. Chen stopped by his office. "Channel 7 wants to interview you, so does the Times." Nathan shook his head. "I'm not interested in becoming the face of this." "You already are," she said gently. "But I understand." His afternoon appointments kept him busy, but he couldn't escape the occasional double take from patients who recognized him from the news. One elderly woman squeezed his hand and said, "You deserved better, doctor." He thanked her and moved on. That evening, driving home, he passed Bella's Bistro. The crowd outside had grown. The restaurant's windows were dark, closed for the day. A lone janitor moved inside, cleaning tables no customers had used. Nathan drove past without stopping. Tomorrow was another day. He had surgery scheduled, lives to save. But as he pulled into his driveway, his phone buzzed with a hospital notification. A new patient had been admitted with a complex brain aneurysm requiring immediate surgery. The patient's name was Dorothy Meyer. He didn't recognize it yet, didn't make the connection. That would come tomorrow. 3 days after the incident, Nathan stood at the nurse's station reviewing charts. Despite the continuing media storm, he'd found peace in the familiar rhythm of hospital work. Here, he was simply Dr. Okafor, not that doctor from the viral video. "Dr. Okafor, they've assigned the Meyer case to you," said Nurse Patel, sliding a file across the counter. "She came in last night with severe headaches. The scans don't look good." Nathan flipped through the file, his focus immediately shifting to the medical details. Dorothy Meyer, 68, had collapsed at home. The brain scan showed a complex aneurysm in a precarious location near her brain stem, the kind that could burst at any moment. This needs immediate attention, Nathan said, studying the images. Has the family been briefed on the risks? They're waiting in room 507, Nurse Patel replied. Dr. Thompson was going to take it, but he's stuck in Baltimore. You're the only other surgeon here with experience in this type of procedure. Nathan nodded, still examining the scan. This was exactly the kind of high-risk surgery he specialized in. The aneurysm's location made it particularly dangerous. One wrong move could leave the patient paralyzed or worse. As he walked toward room 507, he reviewed the treatment plan in his mind. He'd need to block off the damaged blood vessel while maintaining blood flow to critical areas of the brain. Challenging but doable. He knocked lightly and entered the room. 3 people looked up. An older man with worried eyes clutching a tweed hat, a young man around 30 with the same nose and chin as the older gentleman, and a woman with her back to the door, staring out the window. "Good morning. I'm Dr. Okafor, the neurosurgeon who will be handling Mrs. Meyer's case," he said, extending his hand to the older man. "Thank God," the man said, gripping Nathan's hand. "I'm Robert Meyer, Dorothy's husband. This is our son Brian and our daughter Lindsay." The woman by the window turned around. Time seemed to stop. It was her, the waitress from Bella's Bistro. Their eyes met, and Nathan saw the shock of recognition flash across her face. Her mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. Nathan's mind raced. This couldn't be happening. Of all the patients in all the hospitals in the city, he'd been assigned to Lindsay's mother. For a moment, he considered asking for the case to be reassigned. But even as the thought formed, he dismissed it. This wasn't about Lindsay. It was about her mother, who needed his help. Maintaining his professional demeanor, Nathan turned back to Robert. "Mr. Meyer, I've reviewed your wife's scans. She has what we call a basilar tip aneurysm. It's essentially a balloon-like bulge in a blood vessel at the base of the brain, and it's at risk of rupturing." As he explained the procedure, Nathan was acutely aware of Lindsay's stare. She had moved to sit beside her father, her face pale and unreadable. The surgical mask and cap he'd be wearing during the operation would have hidden his identity from her during any hospital visit. She wouldn't have recognized him until now. "The procedure has risks," Nathan continued, meeting each family member's eyes, including Lindsay's. "But without surgery, the aneurysm will almost certainly rupture, which would be fatal." "You'll do it, though?" Brian asked anxiously. "You can save her." "I'll do everything in my power," Nathan answered truthfully. "I've performed this procedure successfully many times." "When?" Robert asked, his voice breaking. "We need to move quickly." "I've scheduled the surgery for this afternoon," Nathan replied. Throughout the conversation, Lindsay remained silent, her eyes never leaving Nathan's face. As he finished explaining the procedure and risks, he asked if they had questions. Robert and Brian had several, which Nathan answered patiently. Lindsay said nothing. As he prepared to leave, Lindsay suddenly stood up. "Can I talk to you outside, Doctor?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. In the hallway, she couldn't meet his eyes. "You know who I am," she said. It wasn't a question. Nathan nodded once. "And you're still going to operate on my mother?" she asked, finally looking up at him. Confusion, shame, and fear battled across her face. "Of course I am," Nathan replied simply. "She's my patient." Lindsay opened her mouth, closed it, then tried again. "I don't understand why you whirled." "I took an oath to care for those in need," Nathan interrupted quietly. "That doesn't change based on who they are or who their family is." He looked at his watch. "I need to prepare for surgery. You should be with your mother." As he walked away, he heard her call after him, her voice small. "Dr. Okafor." He paused but didn't turn around. "Thank you," she said. Nathan nodded once more and continued down the hall, his mind already shifting to the complex procedure ahead. Nathan stood at the scrub sink, methodically washing his hands and arms up to the elbows. The ritual always calmed him before surgery, the familiar scent of antiseptic soap and the steady count of seconds in his head. 20 seconds for each finger, 30 for each palm, 40 for the wrists and forearms. "So it's true," Dr. Wong said quietly as she prepared beside him. "The woman on the table is related to that waitress." News traveled fast in hospitals. Nathan kept his eyes on his hands. "She's the mother." Dr. Wong shook her head slightly. "And you're still doing the surgery?" The patient needs help, Nathan replied simply. That's all that matters in this room. The operating room was already prepped when they entered, the harsh lights reflecting off metal instruments laid out in precise order. Dorothy Meyer lay unconscious on the table, her head secured in a fixed position, a small section of her gray hair already shaved. "Did you see the family out there?" whispered one of the nurses to another as they adjusted the monitoring equipment. "The daughter looks like she's seen a ghost." "Wouldn't you?" the second nurse replied. "After what she did, and now her mom's life is in his hands." Nathan cleared his throat, and they fell silent. "Let's focus, everyone," he said, looking around the room at his team. "This is a basilar tip aneurysm with high rupture risk. Nothing else matters right now except giving this patient our absolute best." The anesthesiologist nodded. "Patient is stable and ready, Dr. Okafor." Nathan took a deep breath and began. "Scalpel, please." Time always changed during surgery. Minutes stretched into hours or compressed into seconds. Nathan worked with practiced precision, making the initial incision behind the ear, carefully creating a window through the skull. Every movement was deliberate, every decision weighed. "Microscope," he said, and the heavy surgical microscope swung into place. Through its lenses, the delicate structures of Dorothy's brain came into view, beautiful and fragile. 3 hours in, he reached the aneurysm. It looked worse than the scans had indicated, a bulging, pulsing sac ready to burst. "Look at the size of that thing," Dr. Wong murmured. "Temporary clips," Nathan said, his voice steady despite the tension. This was the most dangerous part. Cut off blood flow too long, and brain damage would occur. Too short, and the aneurysm could rupture during repair. As he placed the first clip, Dorothy's blood pressure suddenly dropped. "BP'd falling, 90/60, called the anesthesiologist. Heart rate increasing. Outside in the waiting room, unaware of the crisis, Lindsay paced back and forth. Her father and brother sat rigidly in uncomfortable chairs, their coffee long gone cold. A nurse had told them the surgery would take at least 8 hours. They were only at hour 4. How could this happen? Lindsay whispered to herself. The man she had treated so horribly was now trying to save her mother. Her stomach twisted with a mix of shame and fear. Back in the operating room, Nathan remained focused despite the alarms. "I need to reposition this clip," he said calmly. "Get ready with the permanent clip." His hands moved with the precision of a watchmaker, navigating vessels thinner than spaghetti, every millimeter critical. Sweat formed beneath his surgical cap, but he didn't flinch. "BP stabilizing," announced the anesthesiologist after several tense minutes. 95/65 and rising. The room collectively exhaled. Hour 7 brought another crisis when the aneurysm began to leak during the final clipping. Blood obscured Nathan's view, but he didn't panic. "Suction, more light," he ordered. "I can still secure this." Working almost by feel as much as sight, he maneuvered the permanent clip into place, sealing off the damaged vessel while preserving blood flow to critical areas. "Got it," he said finally. The monitoring equipment showed stable readings across all systems. As they began to close, Dr. Wong looked at Nathan. "That was incredible. I'm not sure anyone else could have handled that complication." Nathan said nothing, focused on completing the procedure properly. Outside the operating room, 11 hours had passed. Robert had fallen asleep in his chair. Brian stared blankly at his phone, no longer even scrolling. Lindsay stood when she saw Dr. Wong emerge first, her surgical mask pulled down. "Your mother made it through the surgery," Dr. Wong told them. "Dr. Okafor is finishing up now. He'll come speak with you soon." "Will she be okay?" Lindsay asked, her voice cracking. "The surgery was more complicated than we expected," Dr. Wong replied honestly. "But Dr. Okafor performed. Well, I would call it a minor miracle. Now we wait." Lindsay sank into a chair, tears streaming down her face. She didn't yet know if they were tears of relief, gratitude, or lingering shame. Perhaps all three. The recovery room was quiet except for the steady beep of monitors and the soft hiss of oxygen. Dorothy Meyer lay still, tubes and wires connecting her to various machines. Her head was wrapped in white bandages, her face pale but peaceful. Nathan checked her vitals one more time, satisfied with her stable condition. "She's doing remarkably well," Nurse Patel said, updating the chart. Will you speak to the family now? Nathan nodded, removing his surgical cap. His neck and shoulders ached from hours bent over the operating table. Coffee would have to wait. The family had been waiting long enough. In the consultation room, Robert Meyer jumped to his feet when Nathan entered. Brian stood too, dark circles under his eyes. Lindsay remained seated, her hands gripping each other so tightly her knuckles were white. Mrs. Meyer made it through surgery successfully, Nathan began, his voice slightly hoarse from fatigue. The aneurysm was larger and more complex than we anticipated, but we were able to secure it completely. Robert's shoulders sagged with relief. She'll be okay. We need to monitor her closely for the next 48 hours, Nathan explained, but I'm cautiously optimistic. She responded well throughout the procedure. As he continued explaining the surgery and recovery process, Nathan removed his surgical mask, tucking it into his pocket. Lindsay, who had been staring at the floor, finally looked up at him fully. Her breathing hitched and a small sound escaped her throat. The room fell silent. "You?" she whispered, her face draining of color. Recognition and shock washed over her features as the full reality hit her. This wasn't just any doctor who had spent 11 hours saving her mother's life. This was the man she had told to go back to Africa 3 days ago. Brian looked between them, confused. "Lindsay, what's wrong?" Lindsay stood on shaky legs, tears welling in her eyes. "Dad, this is the doctor from the restaurant. The one I..." Her voice broke, unable to repeat her own words. Robert turned to Nathan, his expression shifting from confusion to horrified understanding. "Oh my God," he said quietly. "You're the doctor from the news. The one my daughter..." "I don't understand," Brian cut in, looking lost. A passing nurse paused in the doorway, overhearing. She whispered something to another staff member, and Nathan knew the connection was now becoming public knowledge throughout the hospital. Robert stepped forward, his hands trembling. "Doctor, I cannot begin to express. My daughter's behavior was inexcusable. And then you saved my wife's life?" "I'm a doctor," Nathan replied simply. "Your wife needed surgery." Lindsay covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking. When she looked up, her makeup was streaked with tears. "Why? Why would you help us after what I said to you?" The room was completely still as everyone waited for Nathan's answer. The weight of the question hung in the air between them. "Because it was the right thing to do," Nathan said, meeting her eyes directly. "And because your mother isn't responsible for your actions." Lindsay flinched as if his words were a physical blow. Brian had pulled out his phone, searching for something, probably the viral video he had somehow missed. "Oh, Lindsay," he whispered as he found it, his face falling. "How could you?" Robert placed a hand on Nathan's arm, his grip firm despite his age. "My wife and I raised our children better than this. I am so deeply sorry for what happened." Nathan nodded his acknowledgement. He was tired, bone-tired, and the conversation was veering into territory he hadn't prepared for. He'd done his job as a surgeon. He wasn't required to process this family's guilt or shame. "Mrs. Meyer will remain sedated for the next few hours," he continued professionally. "When she wakes, she'll be disoriented and uncomfortable. That's normal. She'll need extensive follow-up care over the coming months." "And will you..." Lindsay started, then paused, swallowing hard. "Will you still be her doctor?" Nathan looked at her tear-stained face, feeling neither vindication nor anger, just the weary satisfaction of a difficult job completed successfully. "Yes," he said. "I'll continue to oversee her care personally." He turned to leave, but paused at the door. "The human brain is remarkable," he added quietly. "It can heal from tremendous damage, given time and proper care. But it needs patience and consistent support through the recovery process." He wasn't just talking about Dorothy's brain, and from the look on Lindsay's face, she knew it. 6 months later, a Felicstein hung in the window of what had once been Bella's Bistro. The restaurant had never recovered from the scandal. Customers stopped coming, then staff quit, and finally, the owners closed the doors for good. The polished wooden tables and fancy lighting fixtures had been sold off at auction. Across town, in the community center auditorium, Lindsay Meyer stood at a podium, facing a room full of people. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore a plain blue blouse instead of a waitress uniform. The crowd watching her included local business owners, school teachers, and ordinary citizens who had come for the monthly community dialogue on building a better city. "I was raised in this town," Lindsay said, her voice stronger than she felt. "I went to school here, made friends here, and thought I knew who I was. Then 6 months ago, I said something terrible to a customer at the restaurant where I worked." She paused, taking a breath. "Most of you probably saw the video. I told a black doctor to go back to Africa because I was frustrated and because I had beliefs I'd never examined. Beliefs I didn't even realize were inside me until they came out in the worst possible way." The room was silent. Some people shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but no one interrupted. 3 days later, my mother had a brain aneurysm. The only surgeon available who could perform the operation that saved her life was that same doctor, Dr. Nathan Okafor. Lindsay's voice cracked slightly, but she continued. "He could have refused. No one would have blamed him. Instead, he operated for 11 hours straight and saved my mom's life. When I asked him why, he said simply, because it was the right thing to do." In the back of the room, unnoticed by Lindsay, Nathan slipped in quietly and stood against the wall. He hadn't planned to attend, but his last appointment had finished early, and curiosity had drawn him here. "That moment changed everything for me," Lindsay continued. "I lost my job, yes. Friends stopped talking to me. I deserved that. But I also gained something, a chance to really see myself and choose who I wanted to become." She gestured to her chest, where a student ID badge hung. "I'm studying nursing now. And twice a week, I'd volunteer here at the Immigrant Resource Center, helping new arrivals navigate healthcare paperwork, find housing, and connect with job training." At the hospital across town, Dorothy Meyer was showing a new patient how to use the physical therapy equipment. Her recovery had been remarkable, the thin scar behind her ear the only visible reminder of her brush with death. She volunteered 3 days a week now, helping other neurosurgery patients navigate their recovery. The hardest part, Lindsay was saying to the audience, isn't facing other people's anger. It's facing yourself and asking why you held those thoughts in the first place. Where did they come from? What made me think it was okay to speak to another human being that way? Nathan watched silently from the back, surprised by her candor. "I don't share this story to make myself look good," Lindsay said. "I'm not a hero in this story. I'm sharing it because I learned that change is possible even after terrible mistakes, and because sometimes the people we hurt the most show us the greatest humanity." Meanwhile, in the dean's office at the city's medical school, a framed certificate acknowledged the new Okafor Scholarship for underrepresented groups in medicine. The program, funded anonymously but widely known to be from Nathan, would support 5 students each year. When the community meeting ended, people gathered in small groups, talking intensely. Lindsay collected her notes, not noticing Nathan until he was standing in front of her. "That was quite a speech," he said quietly. She looked up, startled. "Dr. Okafor, I didn't know you were here." "I was curious," he admitted. "How's your mother doing?" "Better every day. Thanks to you." She hesitated. "She asked me to thank you again, next time I saw you." Nathan nodded. An awkward silence fell between them. "I've been offered a teaching position," Lindsay finally said. "At the nursing school. Talking to students about ethics and patient dignity." "You'll be good at that," Nathan replied. "Few people understand the cost of those lessons as well as you do now." As they walked toward the exit, a young boy stopped Nathan. "Are you the doctor from the video?" "My mom says you're a hero." Nathan smiled slightly. "I'm just a doctor who did his job," he replied, glancing at Lindsay. "Sometimes that's all it takes."